morning. This is a big topic that maybe you've seen the headline. The fertility rate in the U.S. has hit an all-time low. New data from the CDC showing the fertility rate in 2024 was actually less than 1.6 births per woman.
According to the CDC, the United States birth rate has now fallen to the lowest point in recorded American history. Gen Z is having over 50% fewer children than the generation of the 1950s. And on the surface, the headlines make it sound simple. Young people are selfish. They'd rather travel. They'd rather scroll. They'd rather do anything except grow up and start a family. But here's the thing nobody is saying out loud. When childcare costs more than rent in all 50 states, when 60% of Americans cannot afford a minimal quality of life, and when the average new hire in 2025 is 42 years old, you have to stop and ask a very different question. Did Gen Z give up on having kids? Or did the system give up on Gen Z first? This is not a story about laziness. This is not a story about avocado toast or Instagram vacations or a generation that just doesn't want to be inconvenienced. This is a story that has been building for over 2 centuries. And if you follow it carefully, the ending stops being shocking. It starts being inevitable. Let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand where we are today, you have to understand something that most people in this conversation completely skip over. Children were not always a personal choice. For most of American history, they were an economic necessity. In 1791, Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton wrote a report arguing that children who would otherwise be idle could serve as a source of cheap labor for a growing nation. In agricultural communities, children worked the fields. They looked after younger siblings. They were not a financial burden. They were a financial strategy. Historians studying working-class households in Philadelphia found that children contributed between 28 and 33% of total family income. For Irish and German immigrant families, that number reached as high as 46%. Parents didn't just want large families. They needed them to survive, to pay rent, to eat. So here's the critical shift. The moment families had enough economic stability to think long-term, the birth rate started to fall. By 1930, women married to men in professional and managerial roles had 18% fewer children than those married to farmers. Fewer children meant better education. Better education meant upward mobility. The math was cold, but it was clear. Children stopped being assets. And when that happened, people started having fewer of them. That pattern did not begin with Gen Z. It began the moment America got comfortable enough to have a choice. Now fast forward to the Great Depression. Birth rates dropped 26% between 1926 and 1936. Marriage rates fell 22%. An entire generation looked at the future and said, "We cannot afford to build one right now." A journalist named John Chamberlain, who would later become one of the most influential voices in American political thought, warned at the time that prolonged economic stagnation was not creating a lazy generation. It was creating a trapped one. Young people with no memory of a good economy, no plentiful opportunities, and no reason to believe tomorrow would look different from today. Sound familiar? But here's what changed everything. By the late 1930s, New Deal programs poured federal investment into jobs, infrastructure, schools, hospitals. Between 1933 and 1939, over 40,000 new public buildings were constructed. Young men had work. Young families had a reason to plan ahead. And even before the war ended, something remarkable happened. Birth rates started climbing. Historians now believe the baby boom began before the soldiers even came home. Not because the economy had fully recovered, but because people had something rarer and more powerful than money. They had hope. And when the post-war economy fully arrived, with low-interest home loans, rising wages, pensions, employer-covered childcare, and health insurance, that hope became action. Between 1946 and 1964, over 76 million babies were born. The baby boom was not an accident. It was the natural result of a generation that felt genuinely invested in by the society around them. So what does that tell us About right now? Gen Z is the most educated generation in American history. They are also facing one of the most hostile economic environments any generation has entered adulthood in. Entry-level hiring has collapsed by nearly 50% in just 3 years. The average share of the workforce aged 25 and younger has fallen from 15% in 2022 to less than 9% today. And going to college no longer guarantees a way out. A minimum wage worker in 1989 could cover an entire year of tuition and room and board by working roughly 24.5 hours a week. To do the same thing today, that same worker would need to earn over $2,000 an hour. Let that sink in. Meanwhile, the average Gen Z student is carrying around $526 a month in student loan payments. The average monthly cost of childcare sits at $1,100. That is a combined monthly financial commitment of over $1,600 before rent, before groceries, before health insurance, before a single emergency. And the median Gen Z income is sitting around $50,000 a year, which means raising a child at roughly $23,000 annually consumes nearly half of what many young people earn. Not because Gen Z is careless, because the numbers simply do not work. And if you think this channel has been valuable in helping you understand what is actually happening in the economy, please consider subscribing to Signal and Shift. It would genuinely mean the world, and it helps this channel keep doing exactly this kind of work. Now back to the story. Here's the part that rarely gets discussed in mainstream conversations. People will endure enormous hardship when they believe tomorrow will be better than today. That is the entire lesson of the baby boom. It was not wealth that triggered it. It was optimism. It was the belief that investment was real, that the future was being built with them in mind. Gen Z does not feel that, and the data supports why. Researchers at the University of Sydney have pointed to a growing Gen Z mental health crisis rooted in economic insecurity and social instability. In South Korea, young people are calling their country hell Joseon, a hellish and hopeless society. In China, Gen Z calls themselves rat people, a term describing burnout, high unemployment, and total disillusionment with the idea that hard work leads anywhere. In Canada, despite Gen Z saving more than any previous generation, they have largely given up on ever owning a home. This is not a cultural quirk. This is a global pattern. And the internet means young people across every country can see each other experiencing the exact same thing, which only deepens the feeling that the system is the problem, not the individual. Now add one more layer. It is not just economic fear driving delayed family formation. It is a very specific, very personal kind of fear that does not show up in any economic report. A significant number of young people today grew up watching their own families fracture, divorce, financial deception, emotional instability. They watched adults perform stability while quietly drowning in debt, hidden credit lines, liquidated retirement accounts, and many of them made a very quiet, very private decision. I am not doing that to a child until I am certain I can do it differently. That is not selfishness. That is responsibility. And it deserves to be called what it is. The conversation around Gen Z and birth rates keeps getting trapped in the wrong frame. It treats the birth rate as a cultural problem caused by individual attitudes, but the historical record tells a completely different story. Every time birth rates have declined sharply in American history, the cause has been the same: economic instability combined with a collapse in the belief that tomorrow holds something worth preparing for. And every time birth rates have recovered, the cause has been the same too: real, visible, tangible investment in the people being asked to build the future. Not speeches, not lectures about responsibility. Investment. The irony is devastating. The same generation being called selfish for not having children is the generation watching their purchasing power shrink, their job market close, their housing costs explode, and their future grow less certain by the year. They are being asked to take the biggest financial and emotional risk of a human life, in conditions specifically designed to make that risk as dangerous as possible. So the question was never whether Gen Z gave up on having kids. The real question is this: at what point does a society have to look in the mirror and ask why an entire generation stopped believing the future was worth building toward? Because the history is clear. When the answer to that question changes, the birth rate changes with it. It always has, and it always will. If this video made you think differently about the conversation around Gen Z and family formation, hit the like button and subscribe to Signal and Shift. It genuinely helps more people find these conversations, and it means everything to be able to keep making them. See you in the next one.